Right now, the world is holding its breath, and most people watching the news have no idea why they should be scared. Yemen just entered the war, not as a peripheral nuisance, not as a footnote in a broader Middle Eastern conflict, but as a full belligerent with strategic reach, operational coordination with Tehran, and the demonstrated ability to disrupt the most critical shipping lane on the planet. And every anchor on every news channel is treating this like a minor escalation, a sideshow to the main event, a tribal militia acting up in a country most Americans cannot find on a map. But here is the thing, this is not a sideshow at all. This might be the most consequential military development of the entire conflict, because what Yemen's entry into this war actually means, when you strip away the dismissive commentary and look at the operational reality, is that the United States has just walked into a two-front trap so textbook, so structurally identical to the strategic catastrophes that have destroyed great power campaigns throughout modern history, that the fact nobody in Washington is publicly acknowledging it should terrify you more than the trap itself. If you are learning something here, please hit subscribe. Many of you know what has been happening with the channel lately, and I am grateful to every person who has stayed. If you feel like supporting, there is a link in the description. I have spent months researching what is coming between 2026 and 2030, and I put everything I found into the ebook. If you want it, the link is in the description. Now, to understand why Yemen changes everything, you have to go back further than the Red Sea. You have to go back to the most dangerous strategic miscalculation of the 20th century, because the parallel is not approximate, it is precise. In October 1962, the United States discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. That discovery triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days that brought humanity closer to extinction than any event before or since. But here is the aspect of that crisis that applies directly to what is happening in the Red Sea right now, and it is the aspect that most historical accounts overlook. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not primarily about the missiles. The missiles were the visible threat. The real crisis, the structural crisis that made those 13 days so genuinely dangerous, was that the Soviet placement of missiles in Cuba created a second front that the American military was not configured to manage simultaneously with its existing global commitments. Before October 1962, American strategic planning was built around a single primary threat axis, the Soviet Union threatening Western Europe through the Fulda Gap and the North Atlantic. Every war plan, every deployment, every logistics chain, every alliance structure was oriented toward that single axis. The missiles in Cuba did not just threaten Florida, they split the American strategic picture in two. Suddenly, the Pentagon had to plan for simultaneous contingencies on two completely different geographic axes, one in Europe and one 90 miles from Miami. And the military infrastructure, the command structures, the logistics, and the decision-making bandwidth were not designed for that level of simultaneous complexity. That is what made the crisis existentially dangerous. Not the warheads, the geometry. The introduction of a second axis of threat that the existing strategic architecture could not accommodate without fundamental restructuring that there was no time to perform. That is exactly, precisely, structurally, geometrically what Yemen's entry into this war has done to the American military position in the Middle East. Before Yemen's involvement, the American strategic picture in the region was complicated but manageable. The threat axis ran east-west, Iran and its allies versus the United States and its partners across the Persian Gulf. Carrier strike groups could position themselves in the Arabian Sea. Air assets could operate from Gulf state bases. The logistics chain ran through well-established supply corridors. The defensive perimeter was understood. When Yemen entered the war and began launching anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and explosive-laden autonomous drones against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the threat geometry changed overnight. A second axis opened, not east-west, north-south. And this axis targets not the American military directly, but something far more strategically significant, the global economic jugular. 12% of all global trade passes through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Approximately 30% of the world's container shipping, 8% of global grain trade, petroleum products, liquefied natural gas, manufactured goods, raw materials. The circulatory system of the global economy runs through a waterway that is now under active military threat from a force that the United States has been unable to suppress despite months of sustained aerial bombardment. Now let me give you the numbers because the numbers are the argument and the numbers are devastating. I want you to set aside everything you think you know about Yemen, the poverty, the civil war, the humanitarian crisis, and focus exclusively on the operational mathematics because the mathematics tell a story that no amount of Pentagon briefing room optimism can contradict. The United States has spent, by conservative estimates, over $2 billion on Operation Prosperity Guardian and related strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen since the campaign began. $2 billion. Now I want you to think about what $2 billion buys. That is the cost of approximately 3 Virginia-class attack submarines. That is the annual operating budget of a carrier strike group. That is the cost of equipping and training an entire Marine Expeditionary Brigade. $2 billion spent against a militia force operating from one of the poorest countries on earth, a country with a GDP smaller than that of the city of Omaha, Nebraska. And in exchange for that $2 billion, here is what the United States has achieved. The Houthis have not only continued their attacks on Red Sea shipping, they have escalated them. They have increased the frequency. They have expanded the geographic range. They have introduced new weapon systems that did not appear in the early months of the campaign, including anti-ship ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 2,000 kilometers, hypersonic profile re-entry vehicles that significantly complicate Aegis interception, underwater explosive drone systems, and explosive-laden surface drone boats that threaten warships in littoral waters, where the reaction time between detection and impact can be measured in seconds. The cost of each American interceptor missile tells the story in its most concentrated form. A Standard Missile 2 or Standard Missile 6, fired from the vertical launch cells of an Arleigh Burke-class Aegis destroyer, costs between $2 million and $4 million per individual round. The cost of the Houthi drone or missile being intercepted ranges from a few $1,000s for a modified commercial drone to perhaps $50,000 for a more sophisticated cruise missile variant. The cost-exchange ratio, the single most important number in any sustained military campaign, is approximately 100 to 1 in favor of the attacker. 100 to 1. Let that settle. For every dollar the Houthis spend attacking, the United States spends $100 defending. That ratio is not sustainable over months, let alone years. The Houthis can maintain this campaign for a decade at current expenditure levels without meaningfully straining their resources or their patrons' resources. The United States Navy cannot sustain the interceptor expenditure indefinitely without degrading its missile inventories for other contingencies, specifically and most critically, the Pacific Theater and the defense of Taiwan, which the Navy has explicitly and publicly identified as its primary strategic priority for the coming decade. Every single missile fired at a Houthi drone over the Red Sea is a missile that will not be available in a Taiwan contingency. Every Aegis destroyer deployed to escort commercial shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb is a destroyer that is not deployed in the Western Pacific, screening a carrier operating near the Taiwan Strait. This is the two-front trap in its purest, most mathematical form, and the mathematics are unforgiving. The trap works like this, and I want you to follow the strategic logic step by step so there is no ambiguity about the mechanism. When a great power faces threats on a single geographic axis, it can concentrate its forces, its logistics chains, its intelligence collection assets, and its command attention on that single axis. Concentration is the foundation of military effectiveness. It is the first principle taught in every war college on earth, from West Point to Sandhurst to the PLA National Defense University in Beijing. Sun Tzu identified it 2,500 years ago. Clausewitz formalized it in the 19th century. It has never been superseded because it cannot be superseded. It is an arithmetic truth. When a second axis of threat opens, particularly when that second axis threatens not the great power's military forces directly, but the economic infrastructure that sustains the great power's alliance network and domestic economy, the principle of concentration collapses. The great power must divide. It must divide its forces between two theaters. It must divide its logistics between two supply chains. It must divide its intelligence bandwidth between two sets of targets. And it must divide its command attention, the most finite and irreplaceable resource in any military organization, between two sets of problems that require different force compositions, different rules of engagement, different diplomatic frameworks, and different political justifications to the domestic audience. The division does not reduce the great power's effective capability by half. It reduces capability by more than half, because the overhead of maintaining two separate operational commands, two separate logistics architectures, and two separate political narratives consumes institutional resources, staff time, planning cycles, decision-making bandwidth that would otherwise be available for actual operations. This is not theory. This is not conjecture. This is the documented and consistent mechanism by which two-front commitments have degraded and ultimately destroyed military campaigns throughout modern history. Nazi Germany's strategic position collapsed when the Western Front opened alongside the Eastern Front. Imperial Japan's position in the Pacific became untenable when it simultaneously faced American naval power in the Central Pacific and British Indian forces in Burma. The Soviet Union's strategic position deteriorated when the Afghan war drained resources needed for the European confrontation. In every case, the mechanism is identical. The second front does not need to be as dangerous as the first front. It only needs to exist. Its existence is sufficient to break the concentration that makes the first front manageable. Now here is what nobody is telling you about this situation, and it is the observation that should reframe your entire understanding of Yemen's role in this conflict. The primary beneficiary of Yemen's entry into this war is not Iran. Iran benefits, certainly. The Houthis are Iranian allies. They receive Iranian weapons, training, and intelligence support, and their operations advance Iranian strategic objectives by stretching American resources across multiple theaters. But Iran is not the primary beneficiary. The primary beneficiary is China. And the mechanism through which China benefits is so elegant, so structurally efficient, and so invisible to the Western media narrative that it deserves to be studied as a case study in strategic opportunism for decades to come. Here is how it works. Every American warship deployed to the Red Sea to escort commercial shipping and intercept Houthi missiles is a warship that is not deployed in the Western Pacific. Every $1 billion spent on Red Sea operations is $1 billion subtracted from Pacific readiness. Every month that senior Navy commanders spend managing the Red Sea crisis is a month they are not spending on Taiwan contingency planning. The United States Navy has publicly stated that it does not have enough ships to simultaneously maintain its current commitments in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. The Red Sea operations have stretched this deficit to its breaking point. And while America's naval attention is split between the Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Pacific, China is conducting the largest peacetime naval expansion in human history, commissioning warships at a rate that exceeds American production by a factor of 3. China does not need to fire a shot. China does not need to provoke a crisis. China just needs the Red Sea to remain unstable long enough to complete the next phase of its naval buildup, and the Houthis, at a cost of perhaps a few $100 million per year in Iranian support, are providing exactly that distraction. The most expensive navy in human history is being strategically pinned down by one of the poorest countries on earth, and the nation that benefits most is 8,000 kilometers away, building ships. Now let me give you 3 scenarios for how this two-front situation resolves, because the situation is dynamic and there are branching paths ahead. Scenario 1 is sustained commitment. The United States maintains its Red Sea operations indefinitely, continuing to escort shipping, intercept missiles, and conduct periodic strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen. This scenario preserves the appearance of American naval dominance in the region, but at a cost that compounds over time, financially, materially, and in terms of strategic opportunity cost in the Pacific. Under this scenario, the two-front trap deepens rather than resolves, and the primary beneficiary continues to be Beijing. This is the most likely scenario because it requires no difficult political decisions. It requires only continuation. Scenario 2 is escalation. The United States dramatically escalates its campaign against the Houthis, potentially including ground operations using special forces or marine units, a comprehensive naval blockade of all Yemeni ports to cut the supply line from Iran, or direct strikes against the Iranian logistics networks, the ships, the warehouses in Oman, the financial channels that sustain the Houthi weapons pipeline. This scenario carries risks that compound on each other in ways that make escalation not a solution to the two-front problem, but an accelerant. A ground war in Yemen would encounter the same mountainous terrain, the same tribal fragmentation, the same decentralized guerrilla resistance, and the same civilizational stubbornness that defeated Saudi Arabia's far more sustained and far better funded military campaign over the previous 9 years. A campaign in which the Saudis deployed tens of thousands of troops, spent over $100 billion, and achieved precisely nothing of lasting strategic value. A naval blockade of Yemeni ports would require diverting additional warships from other theaters, further degrading Pacific readiness, and would face immediate legal challenges at the United Nations from countries that view blockades as acts of war against civilian populations. Strikes against Iranian supply networks risk triggering direct military confrontation with Iran itself, which transforms the two-front problem into a three-front catastrophe of a scale that no American military planner has wargamed and survived. Escalation in Yemen does not solve the two-front trap, it deepens it exponentially. Scenario 3 is strategic withdrawal, the deliberate decision to stop escorting Red Sea shipping, stop intercepting Houthi missiles, and accept the economic consequences of a disrupted Suez corridor while redirecting naval assets to the Pacific theater, which the Pentagon has consistently identified as the priority. This scenario would cause immediate and severe economic disruption, higher shipping costs, longer transit times around the Cape of Good Hope, increased insurance premiums, and a potential spike in consumer prices across Europe and Asia. It would also represent a visible concession of American naval dominance in a region where that dominance has been assumed for decades. But it would resolve the two-front trap by eliminating one of the two fronts, freeing resources for the theater that American strategic planners have identified as existentially important. Strategic withdrawal is the most rational option. It is also the most politically impossible one because no president can survive the narrative of abandoning a shipping lane. Now, I am not saying this situation is permanent. The Houthi campaign depends on continued Iranian support, and shifts in Iranian strategic priorities could reduce or redirect that support. Diplomatic breakthroughs, though none appear imminent, could alter the calculus. Technological developments in directed energy weapons or autonomous interception could eventually change the cost-exchange ratio. But the structural picture as it stands today does not look like a great power managing a minor irritant. It looks like a great power being systematically drawn into a resource-draining commitment that serves the strategic interests of its primary global competitor more effectively than any action that competitor could take on its own. The two-front trap is not a theory. It is an operational reality that is costing the United States billions of dollars, degrading its Pacific readiness, and buying time for the one country on earth that needs that time most. The question was never really whether Yemen would enter this war. The geography demanded it. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait is 19 miles wide at its narrowest point, and whoever controls the coastline controls the traffic that passes through it, which is to say they control the economic lifeline of half the world. The question was always what happens to the global order when a superpower's attention, resources, and naval capacity are split across theaters that are thousands of miles apart, fighting adversaries who have found a way to make defense more expensive than attack by a factor that no budget can sustain indefinitely. That question is no longer theoretical. It is being answered right now, in real time, in the waters between Yemen and Djibouti, at a cost of $4 million per interceptor, fired at a drone that cost $10,000 to build. The math does not lie. The math is patient. And the math right now is not on America's side. This is the video for today. If you want the ebook, the link is in the description. See you later.